What I'm about to tell you is perhaps the most shocking, most disturbing wedding ceremony ever recorded in human history. A night where an emperor's twisted desires transformed a sacred celebration into an event so unthinkable that historians struggled for centuries to verify if it truly happened. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a display of absolute power, corrupted beyond all moral boundaries. The year was 38 CE. The place was Rome. And the man responsible was Emperor Caligula, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with excess, cruelty, and depravity. On his wedding night to his fourth wife, Caligula did something that defied every custom, every tradition, and every shred of human decency. He turned his wedding into a spectacle that would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. But to understand how a wedding could become the most disgusting event in Roman history, we first need to understand the mind of the monster who orchestrated it. Rome in the 1st century CE was the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Its territory stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. At the heart of this vast dominion sat the emperor, a man who wielded power that was quite literally considered divine. The Roman emperor wasn't just a political leader. He was worshipped as a living god, answerable to no one, constrained by nothing except the loyalty of his Praetorian Guard. This absolute power, as history has shown us time and again, has a way of corrupting absolutely. And no emperor embodied this corruption more completely than Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula. Caligula ascended to the throne in 37 CE at the age of just 24. His early reign was marked by hope and celebration. Romans rejoiced at having a young, energetic emperor from the beloved Julio-Claudian dynasty. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, and the grandson of Marcus Antonius. His father, Germanicus, had been one of Rome's most celebrated generals, beloved by the people and the legions alike. The young Caligula had spent his childhood among soldiers on the Rhine frontier, earning his nickname, which meant Little Soldier's Boot, because of the miniature military uniform he wore. When he became emperor, the Senate granted him unprecedented powers, and the Roman people celebrated with sacrifices and festivals. Over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in the first 3 months of his reign alone, a testament to the joy his ascension brought. But this joy would be short-lived. Just 7 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill with what historians believe may have been encephalitis or another brain fever. When he recovered, something fundamental had changed. The promising young emperor had transformed into something else entirely. What emerged from that sickbed was a man whose appetites knew no boundaries, whose cruelty knew no limits, and whose understanding of power had become dangerously twisted. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded that Caligula began to believe fully in his own divinity, not as a political fiction, but as literal truth. He ordered that his face replace the faces of the gods on statues throughout Rome. He built a bridge between the Palatine Hill and the Capitoline Hill, so he could converse with Jupiter as an equal. He appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a priest, and allegedly planned to make him a consul. These weren't the actions of an eccentric. They were the actions of a mind that had lost all connection to reality, restraint, and basic human empathy. By the year 38 CE, Caligula had already cycled through 3 wives with disturbing rapidity. His first marriage, to Junia Claudilla, ended when she died in childbirth, taking their infant with her. His second marriage, to Livia Orestilla, was annulled almost immediately after the wedding. He had taken a fancy to her on her wedding day to another man, seized her from the ceremony, married her himself, then divorced her weeks later, claiming she had returned to her former husband. His third marriage, to Lalia Paulina, lasted only slightly longer. He had summoned her from her province after hearing of her beauty, married her, then discarded her when he grew bored. Each marriage demonstrated Caligula's growing belief that he could do absolutely anything he wished, that no social convention, no moral law, no human dignity could constrain his will. Then came Melonia Caesonia. Unlike Caligula's previous wives, who were young, beautiful aristocrats in the prime of life, Caesonia was neither young nor particularly beautiful by Roman standards. Ancient sources describe her as older, possibly in her late 30s, which was considered quite advanced for a bride in Roman society. She had already borne 3 daughters to previous relationships. She wasn't a virgin. She wasn't from the most prestigious family, and she didn't bring enormous political advantages.
So why did Caligula choose her as his 4th wife? The ancient historian Suetonius provides a disturbing answer. He wrote that Caligula was attracted to Caesonia precisely because of her shamelessness and her willingness to participate in his most depraved fantasies. She didn't just tolerate his excesses, she encouraged them. She appeared beside him at military reviews, completely exposed when he showcased her to his soldiers. She participated in his elaborate theatrical performances, where he would dress as various gods and goddesses. Most significantly for our story, she shared his contempt for social boundaries and his desire to shock, humiliate, and dominate everyone around them. When Caligula announced his intention to marry Caesonia, Roman high society braced itself. They knew by now that any event involving the emperor would push boundaries.
But what they couldn't have imagined was just how far those boundaries would be obliterated on the wedding night. Roman wedding ceremonies were typically elaborate, traditional affairs steeped in centuries of ritual and symbolism. The ceremony would begin at the bride's home with sacrifices to the gods, particularly to Juno, the goddess of marriage. The bride would wear a special outfit, including a saffron yellow veil and a wreath of flowers she had gathered herself. After the religious rites and the joining of hands, there would be a procession through the streets to the groom's home, accompanied by singing and torchbearers. A wedding feast would follow, attended by family and close friends. Then, in the privacy of the marriage chamber, the bride and groom would consummate their union. Privacy was paramount.
The wedding night was considered sacred,
Intimate, and strictly private between husband and wife. What happened in the marriage chamber was never discussed publicly. This wasn't mere custom, but fundamental Roman morality. Caligula planned something entirely different. In the days leading up to the wedding, he issued a decree that sent shockwaves through Rome's elite. All senators and their wives were required to attend the wedding feast. This in itself wasn't unusual. What came next was. The emperor announced that the consummation of his marriage would not occur in privacy, but would take place in the main banquet hall. And that was not all. Every guest at the wedding would be required to actively participate in what Caligula called a celebration of divine union. Ancient sources struggle with the specific language to describe what Caligula demanded. But the meaning was clear. This wouldn't be a wedding feast. It would be an event of mass public indecency, with the emperor and his bride at the center, and Rome's most powerful families forced to join in. When this decree reached the Senate, the reaction was one of horror and disbelief. Senators met in small groups, speaking in hushed, panicked tones. How could they refuse the emperor's command? Caligula had already demonstrated his willingness to eliminate anyone who displeased him. Several senators who had opposed him on minor matters had been executed, their property seized, their families disgraced. But how could they comply? To participate in what Caligula was demanding would violate every standard of Roman dignity and morality. For the senators' wives, the situation was even more desperate. Roman women of the upper classes lived their lives according to strict codes of modesty and virtue.
A respectable matron appeared in public, fully clothed and chaperoned. Her reputation was her most valuable asset, and any hint of impropriety could destroy not just her own standing, but that of her entire family. What Caligula was demanding would strip away not just their clothing, but their very dignity as Roman citizens. Some senators quietly considered fleeing Rome. Others debated whether collective refusal might force the emperor to back down. But ultimately, fear prevailed. Caligula's Praetorian Guard was absolutely loyal to him, bought with lavish bonuses and entertained by his excesses. He had the full power of the Roman military behind him. Any senator who refused his command would likely face immediate execution, their families enslaved, their names erased from history.
And so, with heavy hearts and mounting dread, Rome's elite prepared to attend the most disturbing wedding in their city's thousand-year history. The wedding took place in one of Caligula's palaces on the Palatine Hill, the traditional home of Rome's emperors. The banquet hall had been decorated with obscene frescoes that Caligula had commissioned specifically for the occasion, depicting scenes from mythology but rendered in the most explicit manner possible. Hundreds of couches had been arranged in the Roman dining style, where guests would recline while eating. But on this night, the couches weren't arranged for comfort or conversation. They were positioned to ensure that everyone would have a clear view of the center of the room, where an enormous bed had been placed, draped in purple silk and gold. As the sun set over Rome, the guests began to arrive. They came in their finest wedding attire, the men in their white togas with purple stripes denoting their senatorial rank, the women in their most elegant stolas and jewelry. But beneath the finery, there was palpable terror. Husbands and wives exchanged glances, silently communicating their shared dread. Some of the younger senators had brought their teenage sons, as was customary at important state occasions, not realizing what they were about to witness. The emperor appeared in the costume of Jupiter himself, wearing a golden crown and carrying a scepter. Beside him walked Caesonia, but she wasn't dressed as a traditional Roman bride. Instead, she wore transparent silks from the East that left nothing to imagination, with jewelry that drew attention rather than provided modesty. She smiled at the assembled guests, and ancient sources record that her smile held a mixture of excitement and contempt. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and she relished it. The feast began in an atmosphere of surreal tension. Servants brought course after course of elaborate dishes, from dormice stuffed with pork to flamingo tongues to whole roasted peacocks. Wine flowed freely, perhaps too freely, as some guests drank heavily, hoping that intoxication might make the coming events more bearable. Caligula and Caesonia reclined at the center of the room, feeding each other morsels of food and exaggerated displays of affection. Between courses, Caligula stood and addressed his guests. He spoke of his divine nature, claiming that his union with Caesonia was not merely a human marriage, but a sacred rite that would strengthen Rome itself. He declared that by witnessing and participating in the consummation of his marriage, all present would be blessed by the gods and bound to him in a sacred covenant. It was a speech designed to give religious justification to what was about to occur, to transform degeneracy into divinity. Then, as the last course was cleared away, Caligula gave the signal. Musicians began to play, but not the traditional wedding songs. Instead, they performed compositions that ancient sources describe as provocative and arousing. Dancers entered the hall, performing movements that were explicitly intimate. This was the prelude, the warm-up, designed to break down the remaining psychological barriers of the assembled guests. Caligula and Caesonia rose from their couch and moved to the great bed at the center of the room. What happened next violated every principle of Roman dignity and privacy.
The emperor and his bride consummated their marriage in full view of everyone present. Ancient historians record this fact with obvious discomfort, struggling to find appropriate language to describe the scene. But what made this event truly the most disturbing wedding in Roman history wasn't just that the emperor had chosen to be intimate with his bride publicly. It was what he demanded of his guests. Praetorian guards stationed around the room made it clear that departure was not an option. Caligula then issued commands to specific couples among the guests. He ordered senators and their wives to remove their clothing. He demanded that they recreate what they were witnessing. Some sources suggest he provided specific, graphic instructions about what acts he expected to see. The emperor walked among his guests, observing, commenting, criticizing, and encouraging. For the assembled Romans, this was a nightmare beyond comprehension. Many wept openly, humiliation overwhelming their famous Stoic dignity. Some couples, desperate to survive, complied with the emperor's demands, their faces turned away from each other in shame. Others froze, unable to process what was being asked of them. When anyone hesitated, Caligula would approach personally, sometimes with threats, sometimes with his hand on his sword, sometimes with promises that cooperation would be rewarded with political favors. The younger senators who had brought their sons scrambled to shield the boys' eyes, turning them away or rushing them toward the exits, only to be stopped by guards. These children would carry the psychological scars of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives. Ancient sources record that several of the noblewomen present attempted to flee the room entirely. One senator's wife, whose name has been lost to history, reportedly tried to climb through a window rather than participate in the emperor's debauchery. She was dragged back by guards and forced to return to her husband's couch. The hours stretched on in an atmosphere of surreal horror. Caligula seemed energized by the power he wielded, by his ability to strip away every dignity and tradition that Roman civilization had built over centuries. Caesonia encouraged him, allegedly suggesting specific senators or their wives for his attention. Some historical accounts claim she actively participated in humiliating female guests, mocking their tears and resistance. As the night progressed, some guests dissociated mentally, their minds retreating from the unbearable reality of what was happening. Others became physically ill. Ancient sources mention that several senators vomited from the stress and horror, their bodies rejecting what their minds were being forced to process. The wine that had initially been consumed for courage now contributed to the chaotic, nightmarish atmosphere. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that Caligula finally declared the ceremony complete. He pronounced himself satisfied with the proceedings and dismissed his guests. As dawn broke over Rome, senators and their wives stumbled from the palace, many still partially undressed, all deeply traumatized by what they had experienced and been forced to do. They returned to their homes in silence, unable to speak about what had occurred, knowing that to discuss it openly would risk the emperor's wrath. Many of the women who had been present refused to leave their homes for weeks afterward, unable to face society after their dignity had been so completely destroyed. In the days and weeks following the wedding, Rome was gripped by a silence more profound than any outcry. What had happened at the imperial palace was known to everyone, whispered about in every corner of the city, yet no one dared speak of it openly. The senators who had been present couldn't meet each other's eyes when they assembled in the Senate. Their wives, the matrons of Rome's most distinguished families, withdrew from public life, their reputations tainted by events they'd had no power to prevent. Some families left Rome entirely, claiming business in the provinces, but really fleeing the psychological aftermath of that terrible night. Several senators who had been forced to participate in Caligula's wedding spectacle later joined the conspiracy that would eventually take the emperor's life. The humiliation they had endured wasn't something they could forgive or forget. Ancient historians suggest that the wedding night was a turning point, the moment when Rome's elite realized that Caligula wasn't merely cruel or eccentric, but genuinely dangerous to the fundamental fabric of Roman society. Caligula himself seemed pleased with the reaction his wedding had generated. In the months that followed, he held other events that pushed boundaries of acceptable behavior, each one testing how far he could go, how much he could make Rome's elite endure. He understood that the wedding night had demonstrated his absolute power, his ability to violate any tradition, any law, any person without consequence. For Caligula and Caesonia, the marriage produced one daughter, Julia Drusilla, born just a month after the wedding. Some historians suggest that Caesonia had already been pregnant at the time of the ceremony, which may have been why Caligula finally decided to marry her. He was obsessed with his daughter, convinced that her violent temperament, even as an infant, proved she carried divine blood. The marriage itself lasted until Caligula's death. Caesonia remained with him through the increasingly chaotic final 3 years of his reign, participating in his theatrical performances, appearing at his side in various states of undress, and generally encouraging his worst impulses. Ancient sources suggest that she had genuine affection for him. Or perhaps she had simply become so entwined with his madness that she could no longer separate herself from it. On January 24th, 41 CE, just 3 years after the wedding, members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula in a corridor beneath the palace. He was 28 years old and had ruled for less than 4 years. The assassination was brutal and prolonged, with multiple conspirators stabbing him more than 30 times. After the emperor's death, the assassins turned their attention to his family. Caesonia was executed immediately, struck down by a centurion's sword. Their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, was torn from her mother's arms and had her head smashed against a wall. The conspirators wanted to ensure that no trace of Caligula's bloodline survived to potentially claim the throne. It was a violent, thorough end to one of Rome's most disturbing imperial chapters. The legacy of Caligula's wedding night extended far beyond the lives of those who were forced to attend. It became a symbol of how absolute power, when completely unconstrained, inevitably leads to the most profound moral corruption. Ancient historians struggled with how to record the events of that night, torn between their duty to document history accurately and their sense that some things were too shameful to commit to writing. Suetonius, writing nearly 80 years after Caligula's death, included the wedding in his biography of the emperor. But even he struggled to find appropriate language. He described it in terms that made the horror clear while avoiding the most explicit details, trusting his educated Roman readers to understand what he was implying. Cassius Dio, writing nearly 2 centuries later, was slightly more direct but still constrained by the literary conventions of his time. What's remarkable
is that despite the passage of centuries and the usual tendency of stories to grow in the telling, accounts of Caligula's wedding remain relatively consistent across sources. This consistency suggests that the core facts were well established, that the event was too significant and too widely witnessed to be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. In the broader context of Roman history, Caligula's reign served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited imperial power. Later emperors, for all their faults, rarely approached the level of public degeneracy that Caligula had displayed. Some historians argue that the trauma of the Caligula years led to subtle shifts in how imperial power was exercised, with later emperors maintaining at least a facade of respect for Roman traditions and dignity. The wedding also highlighted the vulnerability of even Rome's most powerful citizens when faced with a truly tyrannical ruler. The senators who were forced to attend had wealth, status, military commands, and ancient family names. Yet none of these advantages could protect them from an emperor who had lost all moral restraint and commanded the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. This lesson wasn't lost on future generations of Roman aristocrats, who became increasingly careful about who they allowed to become emperor, and increasingly willing to support assassination plots against rulers who went too far. As we reflect on the most disgusting wedding night in Roman history, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the corrupting influence of absolute power. Caligula's wedding to Caesonia wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a process that began when a young, promising emperor fell ill and emerged transformed. It demonstrates how quickly civilization's thin veneer can be stripped away when someone with unlimited authority decides that normal rules don't apply to them. The senators and their wives who were forced to participate in that nightmarish ceremony were victims of a system that concentrated too much power in too few hands, with too few checks on that power. They had helped create the imperial system that gave Caligula his authority, never imagining that it could be turned against them so brutally. Their humiliation reminds us that no one is safe when tyranny takes root, that dignity and rights can be stripped away in an instant by someone with sufficient power and sufficient moral bankruptcy. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it's not fiction or exaggeration. This really happened. In the heart of the world's most powerful, most sophisticated civilization, an emperor really did force Rome's elite to participate in a wedding ceremony that violated every principle of human decency. The fact that it occurred at the center of Roman power, in the imperial palace, surrounded by all the trappings of civilization, makes it somehow more disturbing than if it had happened in some distant, barbaric land. The parallels to modern times are uncomfortably clear. Throughout history, and continuing today, we see examples of how power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. We see how those around tyrants often enable their worst behavior out of fear or self-interest, how entire systems can be corrupted by a single individual's moral collapse, how ordinary people can be forced to participate in terrible things when refusing means death. If you found this deep exploration into one of ancient Rome's darkest moments enlightening, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We bring you the historical events that textbooks often gloss over, the shocking truths that reveal the reality of human nature when power goes unchecked. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next journey into history's shadows. And here's a question for the comments. Do you think the senators who were forced to participate in Caligula's wedding ceremony bear any moral responsibility for what happened? Or were they purely victims of tyranny? It's a complex question with no easy answer, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Next time, we'll be exploring another shocking story from history that will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval Europe. Trust me, what we uncover will leave you speechless. Until then, remember that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And some chapters of history are too important, too instructive, to ever forget.